You know, there's a reason the world doesn't sleep on India anymore, especially not when it comes to technology and talent. Something remarkable is happening, and it's no longer subtle. It's not happening in the shadows of Silicon Valley. It's taking place in the bright, restless energy of Bengaluru, Hyderabad, and across 1 million glowing screens in small-town India. Buta, Halo Shodi, Tal. There's a shift underway, not just economic, but deeply psychological. And it's rattling the very foundation of how the West, particularly America under Trump, once viewed the global pecking order. Let's start with a basic truth. Technology is the new battlefield. It's not fought with bombs and boots, but with brains, data, and innovation. And in this arena, India is no longer playing catch-up. It's defining the rules. Indian engineers don't just build apps anymore. They build the infrastructure the world runs on. They aren't just back-office support. They're frontline creators. And that's terrifying to anyone who thought dominance was their birthright. Take a moment and think about the psychological impact of seeing Indian minds leading Google, Microsoft, Adobe, IBM, and now even chip design firms, AI labs, and deep space tech initiatives. So this isn't just symbolic, it's seismic. When Trump speaks about bringing back jobs, restoring American greatness, or controlling big tech, he's not only thinking of blue-collar jobs or Chinese factories. Deep down, he sees a world where American leadership in innovation is slipping. Not to China alone, but to a country they never expected to rise this way. A country built on ancient traditions, democratic chaos, and relentless human ambition. He's dedicated his entire life to representing this country to more people than any other, and to the presence of governments just like the US and the World Bank. He sees a world where American leadership in innovation is slipping. Not to China alone, but to a country they never expected to rise this way. A country built on ancient traditions, democratic chaos, and relentless human ambition. There's also a philosophical shift here. In the old paradigm, power was defined by control. Control of land, weapons, money. But in the modern age, power flows from creativity, from the ability to solve problems faster than others. India's talent surge isn't just quantitative, it's deeply qualitative. There's a certain restlessness in the Indian spirit, born out of centuries of struggle and adaptation. When you mix that with access to digital tools, global education, and entrepreneurial opportunity, you get a generation that doesn't wait for permission. That's what unnerves the old guard. This isn't about exporting call centers anymore. It's about exporting CEOs, philosophies, and models of leadership. Let's not forget how this talent revolution is decentralized. You don't need a Stanford degree or a New York investor anymore. You need a laptop, a broadband connection, and the fire to build. India has millions of those fires burning. Young people coding from rooftops, designing blockchain solutions from villages, launching startups from garages with broken ceilings. What's most fascinating and most dangerous to established powers is that many of them don't even want to move to the West. They want to build from where they are. This is what scares Trump the most: the loss of monopoly, the loss of magnetism, the end of the American dream as the only dream worth chasing. Now look at the numbers. India produces more STEM graduates annually than the US, and many of them are fluent in global languages, technology, mathematics, strategy. But numbers only tell half the story. What truly sets this movement apart is its moral compass. Indian innovation often comes from scarcity. It's not born out of abundance, but necessity. A $2.00 medical device, a rural solar microgrid, an AI-driven crop advisory system, all built not for unicorn status, but for impact. That kind of innovation doesn't just disrupt markets, it disrupts narratives. So when Trump looks at India's rise in tech and talent, it's not just about economics. It's about control. It's about a loss of psychological superiority. He built his platform on the idea that America must be first, that it must lead the world in all things. But how do you lead when others are no longer following? What do you do when people stop asking you for directions and start building their own paths? That's not just a threat to the White House. That's a threat to the myth of Western exceptionalism. And here's where we must recognize the bigger picture. This isn't just about one nation replacing another in a pecking order. This is about a new model of excellence. India is proving that brilliance can rise from beneath colonial wounds, poverty, and infrastructural chaos. That genius is not a passport privilege, but a universal potential waiting to be unlocked. That's more than geopolitics. That's a philosophical revolution. Trump saw India as a useful ally, a market, a counterweight to China, but never as a potential leader in its own right. Now, as India rises on the strength of its talent and intellect, unshackled from Western validation, that old narrative is being torn apart. And for someone like Trump, who thrives on control, image, and dominance, that's the real fear. Remember this, the most powerful empires are not those built on land, but on ideas. And India today is exporting something more powerful than goods. It's exporting belief. Belief in its own capacity, its voice, its future. The world is watching, but more importantly, it's listening. Because when India speaks through its talent, the message is loud and clear. The age of borrowed genius is over. Let's talk about something deeper than headlines. Something far more threatening to traditional power structures than military drills or trade sanctions. It's India's quiet, calculated restructuring of global alliances. Its strategic realignment of international relationships that is shifting the very gravity of global influence. And this is where the fear truly sets in, especially for someone like Donald Trump, because while he saw alliances as transactional, India is playing a longer, more philosophical game, one that challenges the West's monopoly over global leadership. For decades, the world was split between two extremes. You were either aligned with the West, led by the US, NATO, the dollar, or you were pushed into isolation, suspect, maybe even sanctioned. This binary served American dominance well. It allowed leaders like Trump to dictate terms. You were either with them or against them. But India uniquely didn't fit into that framework. It never fully subscribed to Western terms, nor did it fall into Eastern authoritarianism. And now, as a rising superpower, India is using that very ambiguity as leverage. What's unfolding is not a rebellion, but a recalibration. India is no longer seeking approval. It is asserting presence. It has formed strong, nuanced ties with the United States. Yes. But simultaneously, it has deepened defense cooperation with Russia, signed trade and security pacts with France, invested heavily in African and Middle Eastern nations, and collaborated technologically with Israel, Japan, and Australia. That's not just smart diplomacy, it's strategic independence. And for a man like Trump, who thrives on binary choices and leverage-driven deals, this multipolar navigation is unnerving. You see, Trump built his worldview on the assumption that America holds the keys to the global house. But India has found a way to unlock every room without asking for those keys. It's negotiating from strength without submission. That's a psychological shift that breaks the old order. No longer is power dictated from Washington, London, or Brussels. Now it emerges in complex distributed networks, where India is not just a participant, but a hub. What India is doing so subtly, yet so powerfully, is rewriting the map, not just geographically, but ideologically. Its approach is driven by the belief that influence doesn't require dominance and partnership doesn't mean dependence. This isn't just about forging deals, it's about reclaiming narrative. A narrative that says we don't need to mimic the West to matter. We can rise with our own rhythm, our own roots, and our own roadmap. Let's look at the psychological layer here. For decades, developing nations were taught to seek Western validation through aid, alignment, or aspiration. India has walked away from that model. It now seeks equity, not endorsement. That's a dangerous precedent for a world order built on control. Because if India can assert autonomy while growing in power, why can't others? This is what scares leaders like Trump. Not just the rise of India, but the ripple effect it inspired. India's global strategy is also deeply philosophical. It doesn't view the world through the lens of conquest, but through cooperation. There's a principle at play here. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the ancient Indian idea that the world is one family. That may sound poetic, but in diplomacy it translates into a framework that includes rather than excludes, builds rather than breaks. And that terrifies zero-sum thinkers, because when power starts becoming inclusive, the exclusive players lose their edge. Consider how India handled the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It didn't pick sides blindly. It engaged both with pragmatism, not pressure. The West tried to corner India diplomatically, threats, narratives, subtle coercion, but India held its line. It bought what it needed, said what it believed, and walked its own path. That wasn't defiance, it was maturity. And maturity, when it comes from a non-Western democracy, disrupts the script. It tells the world, you don't have to be aggressive to be strong, you just have to know who you are and stay grounded in it. There's another dimension here. India's vision is not anti-West, it's post-West. It acknowledges the contributions of the West, but doesn't center its identity around it. That's a philosophical evolution. When India signs deals with the UAE, invests in Africa, or builds coalitions in the Indo-Pacific, it's not just increasing its geopolitical influence, it's offering an alternative model for global engagement. A model where respect, not fear, defines the relationship. Trump once said, America doesn't need the world needs America. But in today's world, that statement is becoming outdated. India is proving that power isn't about who needs whom, but about who can thrive without needing permission. And that changes everything. When alliances shift, empires tremble. But what India is doing is not trembling, it's transforming. Not just itself, but the very system that once sought to keep it on the sidelines. This isn't a rebellion, it's a renaissance. And the message to the world is clear. If you want to lead, stop waiting to be led. You know, the most underestimated kind of power is economic power. Not the kind that comes from stockpiling wealth, but the kind that comes from transforming the engine of a nation. And this is exactly where India is creating discomfort for old powers like the United States. Because for the first time in modern history, we're witnessing an economy that isn't just catching up, it's redefining its own rules, its own identity, and doing it without copying the Western playbook. And this evolution, more than anything else, makes leaders like Trump feel deeply unsettled. There's something Trump understands very well. Control in global politics often comes from controlling the flow of money. For decades, the West, led by the US, held power by acting as the global banker, the manufacturer, and the consumer. But now, as India rises, those roles are being reshuffled. India is not just an outsourcing hub anymore, it's turning into a global boardroom. It's no longer content being the factory behind someone else's brand, it wants to be the brand. And that, for a man who defines success by branding and business, is a direct challenge. Just look at the numbers. India is already the 5th largest economy and is projected to be the 3rd within the next few years. But the raw GDP isn't what scares those who once saw India as dependent. It's the nature of the growth. It's the philosophy behind it. It's the realization that India isn't asking for a seat at the table, it's building its own table. You see this in movements like Make in India, which isn't just about manufacturing, but about self-respect. It's about producing with pride, about saying we no longer want to be seen as a back office for global giants, we want to be the headquarters. And while many assume this was just political rhetoric, the results speak louder. India is becoming a hub for everything from semiconductors and smartphones to electric vehicles and aerospace components. But here's the deeper shift. India's economic rise is no longer export reliant. It's being driven internally. It's consumer led. It's powered by a rising middle class that is educated, aspirational, and unapologetically Indian. For years, The Western world believed that progress meant westernization, that to develop countries had to become miniature versions of the US. But India's economy is proving the opposite, that progress can emerge from within culture, not outside it. Trump's fear isn't irrational. He sees what's coming. He understands that a country like India, with over 1 billion consumers who are now spending, creating, and innovating within their own ecosystems, will no longer be a market for America. It will be a competitor to America. And psychologically, that's a hard pill to swallow for any former superpower. Let's also look at capital. India isn't just attracting investment. It's creating it. Indian conglomerates are acquiring foreign assets, investing abroad, and in some cases even saving legacy Western firms. This is more than financial activity. It's symbolic warfare in the world of influence. It tells the world, we are no longer waiting for approval. We're writing checks, not asking for them. And that is the kind of independence that old powers fear most. Not military independence, but financial autonomy. You know, there's a certain kind of dignity that comes from creating your own wealth. And that's exactly what India is doing. It's no longer standing in line for foreign aid, IMF packages, or economic lifelines. It's offering aid, setting terms, and leading digital public infrastructure initiatives that even developed countries are now studying. UPI, India's Unified Payment Interface, is one of the world's most sophisticated digital finance ecosystems. That's not just technological evolution, that's civilizational reawakening. So now, when the US or Trump's ideology tries to assert dominance, they're not dealing with the India of the past. They're dealing with a confident, economically rising nation that knows the value of its market, its talent, and its trajectory. That's why trade deals today look different. That's why tech partnerships have become mutual, not one-sided. India isn't signing away its future anymore, it's negotiating it from a place of strength. Here's what this really comes down to: psychological sovereignty. That's what India has reclaimed through its economic rise, the ability to say no, the ability to shape outcomes, the ability to walk away from any table that doesn't offer respect. And for any empire built on control, that's the ultimate nightmare. This isn't just economics, it's identity. It's the realization that India doesn't need to be anyone else to be powerful, it just needs to be fully itself. And that, more than GDP or exports or investment, is what shakes the old world. Because the moment a nation finds its economic confidence, the world can no longer ignore its voice. And so I leave you with this thought. Power is no longer about who controls the most, it's about who controls themselves. And India today is doing exactly that. Economically, strategically, and psychologically. And that is how real revolutions begin. There's a kind of fear that goes beyond logic. It's the fear of losing control, of no longer being the gatekeeper. And when it comes to military influence, that's exactly the space India is entering. For decades, global security was defined by a few powerful nations holding the technological upper hand. Countries that decided when and how others could protect themselves. And yet now, here stands India, no longer asking for protection, but building its own defense with intelligence, intention, and independence. This is not just about tanks or fighter jets. It's about psychological posture. India is fundamentally reshaping how power is perceived. And nowhere is this more evident than in its military and defense evolution. What's unfolding isn't just a rise in defense budgets or weapons capability. It's a reassertion of national identity through strategic self-reliance. And that, in the eyes of someone like Trump, is profoundly destabilizing. Let's be honest, military dominance has long been America's greatest tool of influence. It underpins its foreign policy, fuels its defense economy, and allows it to dictate global red lines. Trump understood this well. He used military deals like business contracts, leverage over allies, threats against rivals. But India doesn't fit that model. It's too large to be coerced, too stable to be dismissed, and now too self-sufficient to be manipulated. That's what unsettles the old playbook. For years, India was seen as a massive defense buyer, a client, not a competitor. But now, India is developing indigenous missiles, fighter aircraft, drones, and space defense capabilities. DRDO, Defense Research and Development Organization, is not just surviving, it's innovating. India is producing supersonic cruise missiles like BrahMos in collaboration with Russia, building its own Tejas fighter jets, and rapidly advancing in naval warfare with a blue water navy presence in the Indian Ocean. This isn't reactive strategy, it's proactive sovereignty. You also see it in India's strategic posture. It no longer simply absorbs attacks, it responds with precision and without apology. Surgical strikes across the border, air raids in hostile territory, and its refusal to bow down under international pressure have sent a message. This is a new India, and it has teeth. But more than that, it has clarity. Clarity in when to use power and when to withhold it. That's maturity, and it terrifies those who once mistook restraint for weakness. Here's the deeper shift. India is now militarizing not out of aggression, but out of principle. And that's what makes it more dangerous to any existing global order. Because when power comes not from the desire to dominate, but from the need to protect with dignity, it becomes unstoppable. It's not fueled by revenge or expansionism, but by responsibility. And in that, there's a deeper kind of strength, one that's harder to predict and even harder to control. Trump always admired strongmen, leaders who showcase might with flair. But what India is doing is far more subtle. It's developing strength with restraint, projecting calm without compromise. It's not shouting to be seen, it's preparing to be respected. And that shift, where silence is more powerful than spectacle, is what truly marks a superpower's arrival. Now look at space and cyber, two frontiers that define future warfare. India's anti-satellite test in 2019 showed the world that it can not only reach the stars, but also defend its place among them. ISRO isn't just sending missions to the moon and Mars, it's building the infrastructure for space-based defense systems. Combine that with India's growing cyber capabilities, and you have a power that's thinking 20 years ahead, not just in weapons, but in information and control. This strategic rise also means India is becoming less dependent on traditional suppliers like the US or France. While it continues to partner, it's no longer locked into those relationships. It's developing alternatives, co-creating with Israel, reverse engineering technologies, and setting up homegrown defense corridors that aim to export, not import, military technology in the future. That changes the entire equation. India is moving from being a buyer of power to being a builder of it. And maybe that's the most unsettling part for leaders like Trump. Because when you sell weapons, you sell influence. When you lose that dependency, you lose leverage. And what India is doing is severing that thread, gently but decisively. It's saying, we appreciate the partnership, but we no longer need the permission. This is what scares the old world. The realization that India's power is not borrowed, it's earned. That it no longer plays defense with borrowed tools. That its strategy is no longer written in Washington, Moscow, or Beijing, but in Delhi, by people who understand both legacy and future. And as we watch this transformation, we need to recognize something deeper. Military power is not just about deterrence. It's about dignity, about ensuring that no one decides your fate but you. India has understood this. Informing leaders that courage isn't optional is the key. India has understood this, and now the world must understand that when 1 billion voices rise behind a shield built by their own hands, they are not just protecting borders, they are protecting the future. Because true power is not in the weapon. It's in the will to never be controlled again. If there's one shift that truly signals a country's arrival on the world stage, it's not just the strength of its economy or the reach of its military. It's the confidence of its voice. And right now, India is speaking in a tone the world hasn't heard before. It's bold, unapologetic, and rooted in something far deeper than politics. It comes from identity, from knowing exactly who you are, what you stand for, and most importantly, what you will no longer tolerate. That kind of confidence terrifies the old world order, especially someone like Donald Trump, who built his power on dominance, control, and loud assertion. Because India is doing something far more dangerous. It's asserting itself through calm, principled defiance. There was a time when India's foreign policy could be summarized in one word: cautious. It balanced relations, stayed neutral, avoided confrontation, and often chose silence over conflict. But today that caution has evolved into clarity. Not reckless, but firm. Not provocative, but unwavering. Whether it's handling border tensions, addressing global criticism, or negotiating international partnerships, India has made one thing clear. It will no longer play a secondary role in a world that it helped shape, spiritually, intellectually, and economically. Trump's worldview thrived on one key assumption, the idea that America could always define the global narrative, that with the right leverage deals or pressure points, any country, even proud ancient ones, would eventually fall in line. But India is not falling in line anymore. It's walking its own path, and what makes that path so threatening to those clinging to the old script is that it's not seeking anyone's approval while doing it. Just look at the way India has handled international criticism in recent years, whether it's questions about Kashmir, internal laws, or geopolitical decisions. India has stopped responding from a place of defense. Instead, it responds with context, with conviction, and with the clear message that its choices are made for its people, not for Western headlines. That's not arrogance, it's sovereignty. Its subservience is what we've seen with even more clarity when the tides of conflicting destinies than when the men and women so far from India appear to sit happily with an appraising look at the choices. Western headlines are not informing everyone. Their suspension is not precedent. Their suspension is not precedent. And every policy made a very specific take on economic lynching and when sovereignty is exercised without apology, it breaks the psychological dominance once enjoyed by powers like the US. There's a psychological truth here that's rarely acknowledged. The West, for a long time, was not just powerful because of weapons or wealth, it was powerful because it held moral authority. It believed its way was the right way, and much of the world, sometimes willingly, sometimes reluctantly, accepted that. But India is challenging that at a very fundamental level. Not through rebellion, but through redefinition. It's saying, democracy doesn't have to look like yours. Progress doesn't have to follow your model. And freedom doesn't require your certification. That ideological defiance cuts deeper than any diplomatic disagreement. Ideological disagreement, because when a country like India, a country with deep democratic roots, a rich philosophical heritage, and a billion-strong population stands up and says, we're doing it our way, it opens the door for others to follow. That's the real threat, not just to American power, but to American exceptionalism. Trump, for all his transactional approach to leadership, understood one thing very clearly. Control comes from narrative, from shaping how others see the world, and more importantly, how they see themselves. But India is rewriting its narrative in a way that doesn't leave space for outside authors. It's embracing its complexity, owning its contradictions, and asserting its right to evolve on its own terms. That kind of authenticity is rare and dangerous to those who rely on imitation for influence. What's even more striking is that India is doing this While remaining open to engagement, it hasn't closed its doors, it simply changed the terms of the invitation. It welcomes partnership, not patronage. It values friendship, not interference. And it expects respect, not lectures. That may seem like a subtle shift, but in the language of geopolitics, it's revolutionary. And perhaps the most philosophical part of all this is that India isn't positioning itself as a new version of an old empire. It's not trying to replace America or compete with China on their terms. It's offering a different kind of leadership, one based not on dominance, but on balance, not on loud declarations, but quiet conviction. And in a world that's increasingly polarized, that kind of centered, unapologetic voice is not just refreshing, it's powerful. Because here's the truth. Power is not just about how loudly you speak. It's about how deeply your voice resonates. And today, India's voice is resonating not just with its people, but with others who've been waiting for a new kind of example. One that proves you can rise without submission. One that shows you can lead without imitating. So here's what I want to leave you with. In the age of noise, clarity is courage. And India is choosing clarity, not to impress, not to provoke, but to stand. And when a nation stands for itself without fear or apology, the world listens differently, because they're not just hearing a country, they're hearing a future. If there's one shift that's quietly shaking the foundations of global thought, it's this: the rise of a non-Western democracy that's actually working and defining success on its own terms. That nation is India. And that fact alone carries more disruptive power than any economic boom or military upgrade. Because what India is doing is not just rising, it's redefining the very narrative of what a successful nation can look like. That's what makes leaders like Donald Trump uneasy. It's not just India's power, it's the type of power. It doesn't fit the old template, and that makes it unpredictable, uncontrollable, and perhaps unstoppable. For a long time, the world was fed a simple story. If you want to be free, prosperous, and respected, follow the Western model. Liberal democracy, capitalist markets, Western education, Western values. And to be fair, for decades, that model offered real results. But it also came with strings, intellectual, cultural, even spiritual ones. It required nations to adopt not just the form of democracy, but the voice, tone, and identity of those who invented it. India never accepted that fully. Yes, it embraced democracy. Yes, it integrated with global capitalism. But it did so while holding on to its cultural roots, its philosophical depth, and its chaotic, sometimes contradictory, yet deeply human approach to governance. India didn't become Western, it became India. And that is what unsettles traditional power centers. Because for the first time, a democracy that's not shaped in the West's image is showing that it can not only survive, but thrive. Trump, like many Western leaders, built his influence on a core belief that the West is the gold standard, the final word on how nations should be run. But India's success poses a profound ideological challenge to that belief, because it's not just growing, it's leading conversations. Whether it's digital infrastructure, climate policy, space exploration, or public health, India is offering models that other countries want to study, adapt, and follow, not because they're Western approved, but because they're working. This is about more than metrics. It's psychological. The West has long held not just political power, but narrative power. The belief that it knows best, governs best, and lives best. India breaks that illusion, not with aggression, but with example. And there's nothing more powerful than example. It tells the world, you don't have to copy someone else's formula to succeed. You can build something unique, rooted in your own soil, history, and spirit, and still command global respect. This is what really bothers someone like Trump, because his strength was in defining the playing field, where others had to choose between American alignment or irrelevance. But India is not choosing. It's building a third space, one where it cooperates with everyone but belongs to no one. That's not just strategic autonomy, that's philosophical liberation. And when one nation liberates itself intellectually, others begin to ask, why can't we? Let's not overlook the depth of India's civilizational memory here. This is a country that has absorbed, withstood, and redefined every form of foreign influence, from empires to ideologies. It has the resilience of centuries and the innovation of youth. It can draw from Vedic wisdom in the morning and launch a space satellite in the afternoon. That kind of duality, spiritual and scientific, traditional and modern, is what gives India its quiet power. It's not chasing Western validation anymore, it's creating internal coherence. That's rare, and that's dangerous to those whose influence depends on global imitation. India's democracy, with all its noise, chaos, and contradictions, has proven one thing again and again. It works because it reflects the people it serves, not because it follows a textbook. And that authenticity resonates. The more the West tries to define success in narrow, binary terms, the more India's pluralism exposes the limits of that mindset. Here is a country that proves you can be diverse without being divided, spiritual without being regressive, and proud without being supremacist. There is something deeply philosophical about that, because power today is not just about economics or defense. It's about meaning, about offering the world a story it can believe in. And India's story is one of belief, belief in itself, belief in progress that doesn't require surrendering identity, belief in freedom that isn't shaped by someone else's shadow. That belief is catching on across Asia, Africa, Latin America, you can feel it, leaders, thinkers, and citizens looking for models that are modern but rooted, free but not foreign, democratic but not derivative. And India stands at the center of that shift, not because it's shouting to be heard, but because it no longer needs to. And that's the real fear. Not that India is rising, but that it's rising without asking, that it's becoming a lighthouse without waving a flag, that it's proving a new truth. You don't have to become like the West to become great. So remember this, the most powerful revolutions don't begin with violence, they begin with vision. And India's vision, grounded in complexity, culture, and confidence, is rewriting what it means to lead in the 21st century. The world should take notice, not just of India's rise, but of what it represents. Because when 1 billion people believe in their own path, the world doesn't just shift, it transforms.